Hello, everyone. I am James Hennelly. I'm the director of RDA Toolkit, and this is yet another episode in our ongoing RDA Toolkit webinars that we've been doing. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, we have Melissa Parent with us. Melissa is the Oceania rep to the RDA Steering Committee. She's also a member of the RSC's aggregate working group. So she's quite familiar with the, not aggregate working group, excuse me, application profile working group, right? Sorry.
No.
Oh, both.
No, I was on the aggregate working group, but I'm not on the application profile working group.
Oh, okay. I misspoke then. Sorry about that.
Right.
I got it right the first time. So anyway, and also she is, as we like to talk about our RSC members, they have day jobs. And hers is as metadata coordinator at the State Library Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. So she has agreed to give us a little presentation on application profiles, which if you joined us early, you've already heard how passionate she is about these, how much she enjoys application profiles. So I will turn it over to Melissa now.
All right, thank you. Well, hello, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for engaging in this ALA webinar. Because I'm the Oceania rep, as Jamie mentioned, I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and it's been really good to see how many people are here from all over the world. And I'm really hoping that this is going to be a good webinar for everybody. And I'm really delighted to have this knowledge sharing opportunity with you, because I've sort of been working a little bit in the dark. So yeah, we'll see how we go. Now, in the interest of transparency, I'd like to share a few following additional tidbits about me and my stake in application profile. So can you advance the slide, please? So we have some caveats. Caveat number one is that I am not a particularly technical person. I've never been in a purely technical role in any organization, so I might not be able to answer the technical questions that you might have about application profile development or implementation. But I do have a broad understanding of the technical requirements and how they impact RDA implementation decisions. So hopefully I can support more technical application profile and implementation considerations during this webinar. And if the content has gaps, then great, we have Q&A. And also I'm more than happy to approach RDA Steering Committee and working group members so that we can further any discussions. Also, I'm really feeling my way through application profile development. So I've developed application profiles only for manifestations, and my profiles for diachronic works and visual works are still quite undeveloped. I also still have some uncertainty about the best way to deal with a really important category of elements, which I will talk about in the challenges section. So I'm not an expert, but I'm working on it. And while I only have experience with APs for manifestations, it's true that we do spend an awful lot of our time working with manifestations, be they books, posters, music, maps, so on. So this webinar is really going to be focused on manifestation APs. And a final bit of info that I'd like to clarify is that I work within an implementation scenario that is probably quite common. So RDA describes 4 different implementation scenarios, and one of those is where we're using RDA or applying RDA in an environment that is based on bibliographic and authority records. And these records, we know, if you're creating a bibliographic record for a resource, these records generally don't describe a single RDA entity, especially when we're doing what we call manifestation description. We're routinely recording information that actually describes or identifies people, family, corporate bodies, and access points. So our manifestations descriptions, they aren't purely about manifestations. And this creates some interesting practical considerations when creating manifestation application profiles. So let's talk about why create APs. So can you advance to the next slide? Okay, so we know that APs, along with policy statements, are an important part of implementing the current toolkit. And we know this because we've been told that application profiles are important. And We've possibly also done some research and have been exploring the current toolkit and going, I see. If you haven't been able to explore the new toolkit, or are sort of like on the fence about APs, let's really dig into why APs are important. So next slide, please. Right. I'm just going to double check because I'm seeing different things. Yes. Okay. So minimum description. So RDA tells us that we used to have this concept of core elements, and the concept of core elements is just not part of the current toolkit. And core elements, instead of having core elements, we have guidance about resource description. And this information is found, of course, in the guidance chapter. And and this is kind of, it's important that we, sorry, let me go back. So when we're talking about core elements, like that concept, understandably, we can't really do the concept of core elements now that we've got RDA, it's an international standard. It's a standard that we're intending to be used by cultural institutions other than libraries, and it's a standard that is compatible with linked data. So by with the concept of core elements, and instead we have this concept of minimum and effective description. There's also coherent description, but I'm not really going to talk about that. So minimum description is found in the guidance chapter, and it really is minimal. It really is. So the list of elements that, and this is just a snapshot of the minimum guidelines on minimum description. The list of elements looks long, but not really, because essentially what all these instructions are saying is that to create a minimum description of a manifestation, your description must include an appellation for that manifestation, and that could simply be an identifier like an ISBN or a publisher number. Further, a minimum description of a manifestation needs to include a value for the expression or the work manifested. So that's really minimal, because according to the guidelines on minimum description, what do we minimally need to record when we're describing a manifestation? We can simply say the title of a book, like Generation X. Or we could give a minimum description, could simply be just the ISBN, which is an appellation, and the title Generation X, which would be the work manifested. So having something, a minimum description that is simply just a title or an ISBN and a title, this has some value for our users, and in that it at least roughly names and identifies a manifestation. And there would be times and places when, as an institution, a cataloging agency, where that's the level of description we can do at this point in time. Fine. But this level of description certainly does not fully support the eFlow LRM user tasks that are really at the heart of all of our resource description activities. So minimum description is not super helpful for us. Can we go on to the next slide? Thank you. So effective description is tells us, it gives us more information, so we can see, you've got a snapshot there. And the guidance on an effective description tells us that if we're creating effective description using resource, we have to meet minimum description requirements, not too hard to do. And here's the fun part, we add other elements that are deemed useful for identification and access. Great, which ones? So the guidance goes on to say that we should be guided by application profiles, policy statements, cataloger's judgment, and the information we have at hand. And that's great. That is very great, except for the fact that there are literally thousands of RDA elements, thousands. I think there's over 10,000 RDA elements. So the very open, we have so many choices here, but this very open instruction that we've got, that we can just meet minimum description and add any other elements that we deem useful. So that's, next slide, please, why APs are important. So APs are very important for a few reasons, for very practical reasons. So next slide, please. The first reason that APs are important is because they really clarify for your catalogers, your institution. Oh, my power came back on. Sorry, I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, I think some people might have missed out on the chit chat, is that I woke up to no power this morning, which was heart-stopping, but it's just come back on, so that's lovely. Okay, now got distracted. Yes, an application profile is really going to clarify for your group of catalogers or your institution or your community, which elements of the thousands that are in the toolkit, which are the elements that you've decided are important or useful for identification and access. So you don't have to create any APs, but if you define an AP or a series of APs, it's certainly going to, APs certainly reduce the time that it's going to take your catalogers to create resources, because it's completely done some decision making. It's, instead of having catalogers have to sort of wade through and try to decide which of these thousands of elements should I use, they've been given a set of elements. So that's like cataloging time reduced. This second bit about why APs are important is a really fun and exciting one, and that is that APs can be integrated into the toolkit to inform a template. Now, in the views section of the toolkit, so when you are logged into the toolkit, there's a setting where you can choose an RDA template. And at the moment, the only RDA template that's available in the toolkit is the so-called RDA standard template, which is just basically everything. But the functionality is there to use APs to specify the elements that are on view for a toolkit user while they're logged in, and which the template can whittle the toolkit into a more refined and targeted set of instructions that are applicable to your institution. So APs can not only reduce cataloging time, they can also be used to create a smaller toolkit. Now, I'm looking forward to getting my APs in the toolkit as a template, and we'll share them globally as soon as I stop tinkering with them, and as well as when I get feedback from a wider community about what might be incorrect or missing. And I'm hoping that as we develop more of a community practice around application profiles, that we'll start seeing more templates that are available for us to pick and choose from. So APs reduce cataloging time, make that toolkit smaller and more targeted for your particular group of users. And third, APs really provide clarity around the recording methods that catalogers can use. And when there's a choice of recording methods, and those recording methods are unstructured, structured, identifier, or IRI, where the recording method is structured, sorry, I'll just stop that. They're also, the APs can also, in addition to specifying the recording methods when there's a choice, because that's it, not every element has a choice of recording methods. Sometimes there's only one recording method that is available. Sometimes there's two, sometimes there's all four. So where there's a choice, the application profile will tell your catalogers who are applying the toolkit which recording method to choose. Application profiles, they also specify transcription methods, which are basic or normalized, any controlled vocabulary that should be applied, and any string encoding schemes that should be applied. So all of these points are to say that APs are important because they facilitate how catalogers can apply the toolkit, the RDA guidelines efficiently and with confidence. They help make the RDA toolkit digestible, and they help catalogers apply the toolkit efficiently and with confidence. So the messaging about APs being important is valid, and it's at heart very practical. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is an AP? In this next section, I'm going to be talking quite a bit and doing a bit of a live viewing of an AP that I've developed, but the toolkit does have particular guidance around application profiles. It's in the guidance chapter in the section application profiles. And that section describes what an application profile is and what it should include. And this section of the guidance chapter is well worth reading, but so is all of the guidance chapter. But because I'm focusing this particular webinar on application profiles for manifestations, I'll only mention the guidance chapter instructions that are relevant to effective description of manifestations. So, right, moving on. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of digest the guidance on application profiles. So an application profile for an effective description of a manifestation specifies which elements should be included and whether they are, they must be included, they might be included, like if applicable, or if they're completely optional. So are they mandatory if applicable, or are they optional? It also, your application profile also specifies whether an element is repeatable or if it can only be recorded once. It specifies the recording method or the methods that should be used. If the recording method is a structured description method or the identifier method, your application profile also specifies the vocabulary encoding scheme or control vocabulary that should be used. And again, if a structured description method is being used, the application profile can specify whether a string encoding scheme or a method of structuring the scheme, the text string, should be applied. So that's all great. And we're saving Q&A until the end, are we, Jamie? Or Ramon, whoever's driving? We'll save Q&A to the end. Okay.
Yes, Q&A at the end.
Okay, well, just hold on to your questions. At this point, I'd kind of be like, okay, any questions, but hold on to those and I'll just keep going. Okay, then, so now that we've talked about we've talked about that, let's get into how do we develop an AP? So next slide for that. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Developing an AP. Now, this is going to be fun because I'm going to be showing you, we'll talk a little bit about the process at this point, and then I'll show you an application profile live. Okay, so let's tick on to the next slide. Thank you. And this process flow has sort of been, I've caught it kind of like, it's almost like it's a sort of cyclical thing, but it's actually the case that you sort of bounce between, like you don't necessarily go all the way through the process. It's more of a case of we start with one step, move on to the next step, move backwards. It's a bit iterative rather than a purely sort of linear process. So, but at the very top, we've got the wording on this. I was like, I need to get something that is going to fit in the, I need to get something that's going to fit into the little box. So I'm sorry about the wording, pure. But it's a concept that you really need to sort of figure out right at the start even when you're developing an effective application profile for manifestations. Because way back at the beginning of the webinar, I talked about or just mentioned one of the caveats in that I'm working with a bibliographic MARC bibliographic and authority environment, and the fact that, when we create what we call manifestation level descriptions, we're routinely recording information that is not, strictly speaking, associated with the manifestation. For example, when we record an access point for a person, we're describing an agent, not a manifestation. So you have to make this decision. Will you limit your manifestation AP to only talk about manifestation elements? Or Will your application profile, your AP, include additional elements that we often record when creating bibliographic records? Now, if you aren't working within a bibliographic authority record environment, lucky you, you won't have this issue. I grappled with this quite a bit because, strictly speaking, a manifestation application profile is describing manifestations. But from a practical standpoint, I really wanted an application profile to be a practical tool to help catalogers do the work that they do and the work that they do so well. And bibliographic descriptions of manifestations often include these non-manifestation elements. So I made the decision to include non-manifestation elements in the manifestation AP. It's maybe not technically correct to do so, but it seems practical. If you were to go the other way, and if you were to say, you know, my manifestation AP, I'm only going to record manifestation elements, then I imagine you would need a way to connect the APs. So you'd have like your manifestation AP, and then you'd have APs for describing a person, or you'd have to find a way to connect those APs up to make them practical for your catalogers. Okay, that was that. And moving on, next slide. Yes. Specifying your elements. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This is where all the real fun begins, because it can be daunting to know where to start when you're creating an AP for effective description of a manifestation. Because again, effective description is minimal description, very minimal, plus any other elements that you deem important for your users and fulfilling those E4LRM user tasks, the find, identify, select, obtain, and explore. And you've got thousands of elements to choose from, so where to start? A really good starting point is if you have policy statements. And if you have policy statements, then it would really, you know, you've got a framework right there. The elements that you have policy statements against are ones that you can look to decide whether or not these elements should be included in your manifestation AP, i.e., and you could also start making decisions at that point about, you know, is it mandatory? Are they optional? Yes, some decisions start right away if you've got a policy statement to sort of develop your application profile from. Now, if you don't have policy statements, as I didn't, you can start with elements that are just routinely used by catalogers. Hopefully you'll have documentation that relates to the elements that you expect catalogers to use, that you'd expect them to use in applying the original RDA. Which would be a great starting point. But even if you don't have documentation, just talking to your catalogers, they know what elements that they always use or sometimes use and occasionally use. And they won't necessarily be using the names of the elements as they are labeled in the toolkit, but they still can tell you which elements do they record. So after the fun of specifying your elements. Now, before I move on to the next slide, actually, you go ahead and advance that. Practical tips. At this point, we're going to have an interesting little crossover because now I'm going to start sharing my screen to show the share screen. This will stop others sharing. Do you want to continue? Yes. Good. So, and I'm going to share that one. Okay. So you are seeing an application profile. Yep. Right. So practical tips time is that when you are working on, so you're
Melissa, we're not seeing it. It says you're sharing your screen, but we're not seeing the document.
Dang, okay.
Let
me stop sharing.
And then try again. It should ask you maybe which document you want to share.
Yeah, this will be fun. Only host. Okay, let me get rid of that. Yep. Hold shift to hold multiple windows. Nope. Is it sharing?
It says that you're sharing, but we're not actually seeing it.
No.
We're just seeing a little sign that says Melissa Parent has started screen sharing.
Well, that's just lovely. Okay. Then, hold on just a sec. I'm loath to do anything with my connection at this point. Okay, well,
If
I'm
you
going to
want,
stop sharing.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, the only
Oh,
click share screen, select document, select
yeah,
share. You did all
yeah,
that.
I did all that. Okay, well, Ramon, if you're still there, you have a copy of the spreadsheet.
Oh,
Beautiful. Fantastic. Okay, we can work with this. So at this point in your process, you've made a decision about what are your elements. You've got, or you've made a decision, sorry, about how pure is your, we've made a decision about how pure is your application profile going to be for manifestations, i.e., are you going to include elements that they're not manifestation elements, but catalogers record them when they're creating manifestation descriptions. And you have got a list of elements that you're going to include in your application profile. Tip number one, right away, starts working in Excel. Excel is absolutely going to be your friend. Now, can you scroll over? It's so weird. I want to scroll on this application. So can you scroll? Yep, that's great. Perfect. So you're going to have particular columns that you really definitely, maybe zoom out a little bit. You're going to have some columns, there's some columns that you definitely want to include. Good. Can you scroll back over to show column? Lovely, that's good, that's good. Right, columns that you definitely want to include are the label for the toolkit element, just toolkit label. And at this point, maybe don't worry too much about getting the naming just right, because you can always go back and refine the label that you've given to your element. But eventually you're going to want to have this column actually recording the label of the element in the toolkit. If you are so inclined, and this is an optional, so column G is the query. This is an optional, completely optional. I put it in there just because I wasn't sure, and I saw another application profile that had done it. So I was like, sure, I'll put this in. I'm still not sure of the utility of it. The query is found in the, when you open up an element in, you're on an element page in the toolkit, and you've got that, what is it? I think it's called the element reference box. Every element has a sort of designation. So for example, copyright date in the toolkit, if you open up the element reference, it's P3007, right? And then you would preface that with RDA, and is for M for manifestation, W for work, E for expression. Yeah, so query is just sort of in there. Still not sure what I'm going to do with it. Domain and range are also optional columns for you, because domain and range are very slippery concepts. They are very slippery concepts. So if you're not confident working with domain and range, then these are completely optional. You don't have to put them in. I found domain and range, I wanted to include them just so that I could more visually see when I was including a non-manifestation element. Because if something's not a manifestation element, then if something's not a manifestation element, then it's not going to have a domain of manifestation. It'll have a domain of work or agent or person. The range column was also kind of useful to see for when, you know, to see, was I going to be recording this as a value of another element, as in sort of, was this going to be a relationship element, or was it just an attribute element where I was just recording a text string? So I found domain and range useful. You might not, don't have to include them. Moving over though, column M, you need to include that because this is the column where you are specifying in your application profile whether an element is mandatory, if it is mandatory if applicable, or if it is optional. Now, I found this part a little bit challenging. We'll talk about that. The repeatability column, you want to record repeatability as well, whether an element can be repeated. And it's interesting thinking about repeatability when you're working within a Mark 21 environment or a Mark environment, because there's a couple of elements that, well, there's more than one element where it's completely repeatable according to RDA, but in Mark, if you're recording that element in or encoding that element in Mark has it as non-repeatable. Not too many, but it's sort of an interesting thing. Next up, recording method. Your Excel spreadsheet that you're using to create your application profile needs to have a recording method column. And this is where you make those decisions about, is something going to be structured, unstructured, identifier, or IRI. Also, have a column for vocabulary encoding scheme or the required value that you're going to record. And this is only applicable to applicable to structured. And I think also yes, structured and identifier recording methods. So not every element is going to have a value for the vocabulary encoding scheme. That's fine. String encoding schemes, mine are quite sparse, but string encoding scheme is a column that I've seen other people include in their application profiles. And this is where you would record, if you have to manipulate a text string for a structured description, how are you going to do so? And finally, your application profile should have a column for transcription method. Is it going to be basic or is it going to be normalized? And basic really is basic. It's pretty much take what you see, whatever is exactly on the item, put it in the resource, or sorry, in the description. So I've found myself mostly using normalized transcription. And additional columns that you might want to add in are for notes. Notes, but that's just for me. Now, can you scroll all the way to the beginning of the spreadsheet? Yes, content type. It's a fun thing here, and you might decide to do things differently, but I created a number of different columns to talk about which type of material this application profile was for, because it's true that the manifestation description that you're doing for a textual resource is very different from one that you're doing for a visual resource. There's some crossover. There's some crossover in the elements that they will use, but certainly there's elements that, the textual resource will use, but not the visual resource. So you could decide to have a separate spreadsheet or a separate tab or a separate spreadsheet, completely up to you, for each content type. But I thought, I don't want to copy and paste when an element is common to all of them. So I ended up creating a number of different columns to record when an element was applicable to all types of content, or was it specific to a particular kind of content. Right, so that's okay. I was just going to, okay, stop sharing. Yes, I'm not sharing this. Can you stop sharing that one? Thank you. And thanks everybody for bearing with the my complete inability to share the spreadsheet, which I was very excited about sharing. Okay, so let's go back into the PowerPoint. Thank you. And I just had a look at the time and realized I've been banging on a little bit much, so I'm going to whip through these parts a little bit. So we've just looked at the application profile spreadsheet. We've gone through the columns, and I'll just have a couple of comments about the MAO stage. So you've got your elements, but you have to decide, their obligation. I found that part quite challenging. There's a logic to it that you might not struggle with, but I found it quite challenging, because if you're specifying something as mandatory, then that means that regardless of the resource, you have to be able to record a value for that element. So the mandatory elements might be quite sparse. Mandatory, if applicable, those ones seem to be the easier. Those ones seem to be the easier ones, because it's sort of like, yes, if it's present on the resource, then let's include. Optional, I've really struggled with optional. You might not have these struggles. Your community, your catalogers, what you want to do with your application profile in terms of driving resource description practices. But I've been quite conservative, because I didn't want to have too many optional elements, because it's almost like every time you're saying, well, optional, it's cataloger's judgment's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. The phrasing, I'm like, meh. But if you have a whole lot of elements that are optional, then that's a opportunity for catalogers to have to think about that. Oh, should I be putting this in? So it's not a bad thing, but for people, I just saw your comment, Adam. We'll talk about that. But it depends on your team. But if you think having too many optional elements is going to weigh down the decision-making process, then reduce your optionals. I've been quite conservative, and I think my catalogers might fuss at me when we get to the next stage of testing. Next slide, please. Yep, other. So when talking about, your and other is like your vocabulary encoding schemes, your string encoding schemes, transcription method, recording method. Those parts I found a lot less challenging to do, because again, sort of looking at the practices that we're currently doing, if you look at the data that you're currently doing, and if you're using application profiles as a sort of way to ensure that your current state is maintaining your current state of resource description, then it's pretty easy to know which recording method is going to be applicable. Now, next slide, please. Test. After you've done all of this, decided what's going in, the elements, obligation, all the decisions around recording methods, the transcription methods, vocabulary encoding schemes, string encoding schemes, repeatability, you've done all that. Next thing to do is to test your application profile. And I actually haven't gotten to that point with my catalogers yet. So I don't have any specific feedback or tips about this. My catalogers are long-suffering catalogers, are eagerly awaiting being my guinea pigs yet again. But this is certainly going to be a very valuable stage, because when you're test driving your AP with people who are doing resource description and working with those specific materials, they will tell you when something isn't working. They will tell you, at least mine will. Okay, so that was testing. Next slide, please. Yes, I'm sorry for the busyness of the screen. Now, I've mentioned a few challenges. There's things that I found particularly difficult when developing an AP, but this is a really huge one. And I apologize for the busyness of this. I tried to make it smaller. One of the biggest challenges that I've had with this, because again, I'm not technical. I'm not a member of the technical working group in RSC. I don't know RDF clearly. So I feel like I'm missing some knowledge, but what we're looking at here is this big, huge list of agent terms, agent elements. So we have so many, we have a really wealth of agent elements that we can choose from. And the agent elements, we're not just saying, person, we're saying creator person, we're saying contributor person, or creator corporate body. And then there's all those refinements. So if it's a creator corporate body, are they the author corporate body? Are they the compiling corporate body? Are they cartography corporate body? So there's like very high level elements, which is, creator agents, contributor agents, and so forth. And then there's the elements that probably your catalogers will actually want to use. So I've never been certain, still challenged by, well, should my application profile, because I've decided that as a practical tool, I want my manifestation application profiles to include non-manifestation elements, particularly around access points for persons, bodies, and persons, corporate bodies, and families. So I made that decision, but I know that my catalogers aren't necessarily, they're not going to want to use those high level elements. The elements that they'll want to use will be quite granular. They're not going to want to say creator person. They're going to want to say author person or arranger person or performer person. So specifying the really high level elements only in the application profile, I'm not sure if I can do that effectively. I mean, I think, and here's where I'm like, oh, technical people on the call, great, help me out. I think that an application profile could specify a very high level element like creator person, I think. And then catalogers could be directed to use the narrower term elements that are available, if applicable. I think. I'm not sure if, and this is again, application profile as a practical document, but if I was working in a linked open data environment and was trying to create an application profile for linked open data, I have no idea how that would fly. Like if an application was expecting to receive creator person, or sorry, creator agent, and then it got author person of work, I don't know. So that's one of the big challenges that I'm grappling with, which is granularity of the elements that record people that are included in manifestation and application profiles. So that's me. So I hope that this was a practical and useful webinar for you. We talked about, why we need to have an AP. Thank you. Talked about why APs are important in light of the fact of minimum descriptions very minimum, effector descriptions very broad, and how application profiles can really streamline cataloging decision making and also be integrated with the toolkit to create a more digestible version of the toolkit. And went on to be like, here's a process, and it's not a linear process. You're going to do some iteration. And looked at practically how do you create a Excel spreadsheet, always use Excel in order to create your application profile, and some of the questions that come up and challenges that at least I experienced when creating the application profile for manifestations. So that's me.
Great, thank you, Melissa.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have some questions. I would just iterate before. Some of you might have heard us on our early chat, but I started working with RDA Toolkit 10 years ago, and people were talking about application profiles then, and they were mostly saying that they didn't know what they were. And so I think it's really refreshing to finally be working on application profiles and to be able to put forward a presentation like this from Melissa, which says here, this is how you dive in, this is how you start learning about it and stuff like that. So that was really great. We do have some questions. The first one is
Me.
the template in the toolkit that spits out this spreadsheet. Is there a template in the toolkit that spits out this spreadsheet? Or are we literally just starting with an Excel spreadsheet? I think I know the answer to
Start
that.
with an Excel spreadsheet.
Start with an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Angela Quiroz asks, what are the main differences between application profiles and library policies?
Yes. Ooh. Practically speaking, they could be very similar because your library policy will talk about which elements do you record and how do you record it. So I wouldn't think of them as completely separate documents, but I would point out that application profiles could be integrated. My internet connection is unstable. Application profiles can be integrated into the toolkit.
Next up, Catherine Amy asked, I have questions coming in two different lines, both the chat and the QA section. So I'm working my way through the QA and then we'll get to the chat questions for people listening. Catherine Amy asks, I'm just wondering how the spreadsheet works if you wish to use more than one recording method. For example, in authority work, we would normally record values of person identifier for person as both an identifier and an IRI.
I'm wondering then if for that, have multiple columns for your recording method? Like having 4 columns for your recording method, saying structured, unstructured, identify, RRI. And then you could just put like a little tick box or a yes in one or more of the recording methods. I think that would work functionally.
Okay.
Good question, Catherine. My authority cataloger has been with me for a little while saying, hey.
You're back. Okay, we have when should institutions that can't do beta testing build APs, participate in early training, etc., to start using this new RDA? When the big communities like MLA, LC, etc., have shared their APs?
That is, I think that's a question of resourcing more than anything. I wouldn't want anybody who's interested and passionate about getting to use the new toolkit, and I wouldn't want anybody to hold back waiting for the larger institutions if they feel that they can have a go. But I'm coming from a very, I'm Canadian and we have a different sort of community in Oceania. We're kind of like, yeah, all right, sure, have a go. So this is what's working for me. So I wouldn't wait if you feel that you have the capability to do so, to not wait.
Renata Balhart, excuse me if I mispronounce your name, Renata. Could you please give examples, an example of elements that you have added to your manifestation AP that are not actually manifestation elements?
Let me just pull up the AP that I was trying to share. And filter by domain. This is an instance for having the domain. Having the domain column in was quite useful. Yep, subject nomen. Creator agent of work, where I'm still like, oh, I don't know if that's, yeah. Contributor agent of work, related work of work, and part of work.
Okay.
Sorry, that was for work. Sorry, there's more. Expression. Content type, very obvious one. Content type is an expression level. It's an expression level element.
Okay. This is one I think I might answer. Rachel Fisher asks, how can it, I assume she means your AP, be integrated into the toolkit? So you did mention toolkit templates, and those templates do involve you having access to our CMS and working with our site architecture. So those aren't going to be open to everybody, but they will be open to people who represent a certain kind of level of large enough community that we feel like the template is going to be useful to a good number of people. But that's not the only way for you to get an AP that can be applied to develop an AP that can make use of the toolkit. An example of this would be the German National Library is developing a cataloging manual, which is effectively a kind of AP that will have links into this toolkit to refer to the instructions they feel are important. The French National Library has already done something similar to that as well. So there are different methods of taking that spreadsheet that you make and kind of integrating it with the toolkit. All right, we're getting a lot of questions from anonymous, which I assume are different people, but maybe they're not. Are there plans to create an AP builder as part of the toolkit? Doing everything in handcrafted spreadsheet is far from optional. There are not plans for that right now, but in the down the road there might be. Certainly the template concept is an AP builder of sorts. So if national state libraries develop APs for their own use, can these be used by other agencies and thereby profit off the others' hard work and not develop your own?
Yeah. Sure. Because again, we try to be collaborative, right? And so yes, in Australia, for example, at the moment, I'm the only person I'm the only State Library Victoria, to our knowledge, is the only national state library that is working on APs. And I've been quite open about the fact that, and when I'm done here, who else can use it? Because why, I've done this work because I find it fascinating and enjoyable. Why wouldn't I share it? So yeah, let's share.
Okay, I'm going to get to the questions in chat now. So Adam Scheft, as you saw, asks, is everything not in an AP optional?
No. No, I mean, so long as you're meeting minimum description, so long as you've got, if you're meeting minimum description, that's the only parts that aren't optional. But then, the point of an AP, I guess, is to define the elements that you still want people to have, even though that they're optional. You still want resource description to include these elements. So technically optional, everything other than what's minimally required, but practically speaking, no. Put other ones in.
So Adam kind of follows up with, for elements that have a policy statement of do not use, where do those go?
Oh, right. They would not go in the application profile. So if that's cool. I hadn't thought about that. An element that says do not use according to your policy statement, and that element is not going to appear in your application profile. And then I guess if you're using your application profile to link to elements, or if it's fully integrated in the toolkit to sort of at the template level to create a slice, then all those do not use elements, people aren't going to see them or be linked to them.
Okay. Kathy Peters asks, how much time has it taken you so far to get the draft you have, and have you started testing it with catalogers yet?
How long has it taken me? It's taken me a lot of time. So I would spend about 3 hours at a burst over a period of, so I would say that the first iteration took between 20 and 30 hours. And then because that was me still getting used to some concepts of the toolkit as well. AP is a really good way to explore the new toolkit and really get your head around some of the concepts in the new toolkit. So it did speed up. Now I'm hoping to get per format about 15 to 20 hours and maybe even less. But, some of my slowness is the fact that I'm not as familiar with, I've never personally cataloged a photograph. So yeah, some of the time that it's taken is just because I'm not an expert in that particular format area. Haven't tested yet because I still keep tinkering, and one of the biggest challenges was that final slide about how granular do I make the person elements? How granular? But I'm hoping to get testing done starting in the new year. My catalogers are going to love it.
We had a couple of questions on this topic. I'm going to use Anne Ryan's version of the question to present to you. Are you envisioning that your catalogers will be working from Excel, or will it transform into something more cataloger friendly?
Oh gosh, no. I'd be lynched. Goodness, no. No. So it would definitely the Excel spreadsheet is just it's a structure, and it's a very visual, structured way of making those decisions around how catalogers are going to proceed with their work. So from this, the idea is I'm going to roll up into policy statements and policy statements into cataloging guidelines, so that at the end of the day, what catalogers end up with is a set of cataloging guidelines or documentation that is really informed by the application profile decisions and the policy statements.
All right.
Using Excel, no.
Yes. Graham Williams asked, how will you tell if data constructed under one AP is compatible with a second AP for record sharing, obviously?
Yeah. And that is a really good question. So part of my information gathering when I was trying to figure out mandatory, applicable, optional elements, my baseline documents were, of course, what used to be core, because there's sort of gestalt and community practice around formerly core elements. And I also looked at, in Australia, we have data requirements for contributing to the National Bibliographic Database. So I made sure that whatever was mandatory for my external environment was included in the internal environment. And there were no real surprises, because, if you've got a very large, very generalized set of guidelines, there's sort of data requirements for data contribution. They're quite sensible and things that you'd be doing internally within your own organization anyway. Yeah, but good question.
Okay. Well, I think we're kind of at our end time here. I will remind everyone that this session has been recorded, and we will put all of the slides and the recording, and including everyone wants to see your Excel spreadsheet, Melissa. So we'll include that document. We'll post that on the rdatoolkit.org site, and the recording will be on the RDA YouTube channel, and I believe you will get a follow-up email after this presentation, folks who have registered, which will include all that information, those links as well. So I should add, Melissa, that all the comments included a wide range of compliments for this excellent presentation for you, and an excellent job you did. I also encourage everyone to join us next month. We do have another webinar coming up, free webinar. Honor Moody, who is the examples editor for the RDA steering committee, will be talking about entity boundaries. So that concludes everything. Thank you again, Melissa. That was great.
Oh, thank you. Thank everybody for coming, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.